because of her look and her skin color. She was humiliated out of her seat by a cabin crew member. Little did Flora know that she was preparing her own trouble. Who is Audrey Wellington Wright that was removed from her seat? Let's find out. Also, do well to subscribe to this channel. Like the video and drop your thought about the story in the comment section. The sprawling terminals of Los Angeles International Airport were alive with the usual symphony of activity and boarding announcements crackling over the intercom, the hum of suitcase wheels against polished floors, and the chatter of passengers bustling through security checks. Among the crowd was Audrey Wellington Wright, a young African-American woman with an air of quiet confidence. Dressed in a tailored yet understated business suit, Audrey carried herself with poise as she approached the boarding gate for her flight to New York. Her laptop bag hung neatly over her shoulder, and a silver watch glinted on her wrist, a subtle nod to her success. A polite smile crossed her face as the gate agent scanned her boarding pass and directed her toward the first-class cabin. Audrey stepped onto the plane, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she made her way to her seat. It was a window seat in the exclusive first-class section, booked weeks in advance for this particular flight. She had chosen it deliberately, knowing she'd need a quiet space to review important documents during the journey. As she reached her seat, Audrey placed her laptop bag in the overhead compartment with practiced efficiency. She sat down, adjusting her position so she could settle comfortably by the window. The world outside the glass was bustling with ground crew preparing the plane for departure, but inside, Audrey was in her element. She pulled out her sleek laptop, its surface reflecting the soft glow of the cabin lights, and began typing away with focused intensity. The first-class cabin was beginning to fill with passengers, a mix of well-dressed business people, socialites, and travelers accustomed to luxury. Audrey didn't pay much attention to the others. She preferred to remain unnoticed, a shadow among the more ostentatious personalities around her. As Audrey worked, the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of glasses filled the air. The cabin crew moved briskly through the aisles, checking seat belts and offering pre-departure drinks. Among them was Flora, a blonde flight attendant with a sharp gaze and an air of authority. Flora had worked for TP Airlines for several years and had developed a reputation for being meticulous, perhaps too much so. She prided herself on maintaining the exclusivity of first class, often drawing her own conclusions about who belonged there. When Flora's eyes landed on Audrey, her step faltered ever so slightly. A dark-skinned woman in first class wasn't unheard of, but something about Audrey's quiet demeanor and lack of visible extravagance seemed out of place to Flora. Her gaze lingered, her brows knitting together as she mentally catalogued the other passengers. She didn't recognize Audrey, nor did she think someone so unassuming could afford to be here. Flora approached with a forced smile, clutching her clipboard. "Excuse me, madam," she said, her tone polite but firm. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Audrey looked up from her laptop, her expression calm but questioning. She slid her boarding pass from the pocket of her blazer and handed it to Flora without hesitation. Flora's eyes darted across the ticket, and she frowned slightly. "Okay, seat 2A, she murmured. "I see. Just a moment." She stepped away, pretending to double-check something on her clipboard. In truth, Flora was searching for a reason to validate her suspicion. She couldn't shake the feeling that Audrey didn't belong in first class. After a few moments, she returned, her smile now tighter. "Madam," Flora began, her voice taking on a patronizing edge, "there seems to be a mistake. This seat is reserved for someone else. I'll need to move you to the economy cabin." Audrey raised an eyebrow, her composure unwavering. "There's no mistake," she said calmly. "I booked this seat 2 weeks ago, and I received a confirmation email." Flora's smile didn't falter, but her tone grew firmer. "I'm sorry, but this seat is reserved for a dignitary who will be traveling with us today. I'll need you to gather your things and follow me." Audrey's grip on her laptop tightened slightly, but she remained seated. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. This is my assigned seat." By now, other passengers in the first-class cabin were beginning to take notice. Some glanced up from their newspapers and devices, curious about the exchange. Others pretended not to listen but kept their ears tuned to the conversation. Flora, growing impatient, leaned in closer. "Madam, I must insist. Please come with me. We need to resolve this quickly." Audrey took a deep breath and closed her laptop. Without another word, she stood, her movements measured and deliberate. She reached for her bag in the overhead compartment, her gaze meeting Flora's briefly before she followed her down the aisle. As Audrey walked toward the economy cabin, a murmur rippled through the first-class section. Some passengers exchanged puzzled looks, while others whispered quietly to one another. None of them spoke up, and Audrey didn't expect them to. She had learned long ago that silence was often the path of least resistance for most people. Reaching the economy section, Flora gestured to an empty middle seat and said, "You can sit here." Audrey sat down, adjusting her blazer as she settled into the cramped seat. She opened her laptop again and resumed her work, her calm exterior betraying none of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. From the corner of her eye, she saw Flora walking away, her posture confident as though she had just corrected a mistake. Audrey, however, knew that this was far from over. Audrey sat in her cramped economy seat, her composed exterior masking the storm brewing inside her. She glanced around at her new surroundings. The difference between the first-class cabin and the economy section was stark cramped rows, and the distinct hum of too many people squeezed into a small space. Audrey's slender frame fit easily into the seat, but the affront to her dignity was harder to ignore. She took a moment to collect her thoughts. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced prejudice in subtle and not-so-subtle ways, but it was the first time it had happened within the confines of her own company. The irony wasn't lost on her, and she made a mental note to use this experience to evaluate their customer service training. For now, though, she had a more pressing matter to deal with: Flora. Pulling out her phone, Audrey typed a quick message to Mr. Jacobs, her trusted spokesman and confidant. "Mr. Jacobs, I've been moved to economy by a flight attendant. She claims my seat in first class was reserved for someone else. Please draft a formal report for the CEO. Hold it for now. I'll signal when to send it." She hit send, her fingers steady despite the simmering anger beneath. Audrey wasn't one to lash out impulsively. She believed in precision, in timing her moves so that they had maximum impact. Her calm, strategic approach had been the key to her success, and she wasn't about to abandon it now. Audrey leaned back in her seat, gazing out of the small window. The aircraft's engines hummed to life, signaling that takeoff was near. The cabin crew moved through the aisles, performing last-minute checks. Audrey kept her eyes peeled for Flora, waiting for the right moment. Minutes later, Flora reappeared, her blonde hair neatly tied back and her uniform impeccable. She was scanning the aisles, her eyes darting from one passenger to another. Audrey noticed the faint crease of worry on Flora's face as she looked toward the first-class cabin. She's looking for the dignitary, Audrey thought, a slight smirk tugging at her lips. Audrey waited until Flora's gaze flickered her way. Then, with calculated precision, she reached for her phone and switched on the audio recording feature. She tapped lightly on her tray table to catch Flora's attention. "Excuse me, miss," Audrey called, her voice polite but firm. Flora turned, her professional smile slipping back into place as she approached. "Yes, madam?" Audrey gestured to the seat she'd been removed from. "I wanted to confirm something. That seat I was moved from, it was booked by me 2 weeks ago. I also have a confirmation email. Can you explain why I was asked to leave it?" Flora's smile wavered for a fraction of a second before she replied, "As I mentioned earlier, that seat was reserved for a dignitary who was supposed to travel with us today. It must have been a mistake on the system's part to allocate it to you." Audrey nodded, her expression unreadable. "I understand mistakes happen, but what if this dignitary doesn't show up? Will my seat remain empty?" Flora hesitated. "Well, yes, in that case. But as of now, the seat remains unavailable." Audrey tilted her head slightly, as if considering Flora's words. "I see. And do you always handle seat allocations in this manner?" Flora's composure faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I'm not sure what you mean." Audrey leaned forward slightly, her tone calm yet pointed. "What I mean is, do you routinely move passengers from their assigned seats without verifying the circumstances, especially passengers who have paid for those seats well in advance?" The question hung in the air, the surrounding passengers now visibly listening in. Flora's face flushed slightly as she stammered, I was just following protocol, madam." Audrey gave a small, knowing smile. "Of course. Thank you for clarifying." With that, Audrey ended the conversation, switching off her phone's recording feature as Flora hurried away. The entire exchange had been captured, every hesitation, every misstep in Flora's explanation. It was exactly what Audrey needed. She forwarded the audio file to Mr. Jacobs with a brief message. "Hold for my signal." Moments later, another flight attendant, Lola, approached Audrey. Lola was a petite woman with warm brown eyes and a genuine smile. She knelt slightly to meet Audrey's gaze, her tone soft and apologetic. "Madam, I'm so sorry for the inconvenience earlier. Can I get you anything to make your flight more comfortable?" Audrey studied Lola for a moment, sensing her sincerity. "Thank you, but I'm fine for now." Lola nodded and moved on, leaving Audrey to her thoughts. The contrast between Lola's professionalism and Flora's behavior wasn't lost on her. It was a small but important detail, one that Audrey would remember. As the plane taxied down the runway, Audrey's phone buzzed with a call from Mr. Jacobs. She answered it discreetly, keeping her voice low. "Madam, I listened to the recording. Are you sure you don't want me to address this immediately?" Mr. Jacobs's voice was tight with controlled anger. "This is unacceptable." Audrey's lips curved into a slight smile. "Not yet, Jacobs. Timing is everything. I'll give you the signal when the time is right." The engines roared as the plane lifted into the sky, but Audrey's mind was firmly grounded, orchestrating the next steps in her plan. She was no stranger to challenges, and this was just another one she intended to handle with her signature blend of calm and precision. She glanced at the message draft on her phone, her finger hovering over the send button. It was only a matter of time before she unleashed the storm she was quietly brewing. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin settled into a quiet hum. Passengers tapped away on laptops, watched in-flight entertainment, or flipped through magazines. Audrey, however, was far from relaxed. She reclined slightly in her seat, her hands resting on her lap, her mind running through the next steps of her carefully laid plan. The recording of her conversation with Flora was now safely in Mr. Jacobs's hands, and she knew he was ready to act at a moment's notice. But Audrey wasn't impulsive. She understood the value of timing. Her years of experience as chairperson of TP Airline's board of directors had taught her that a perfectly executed move often required patience. Audrey was a force to be reckoned with, though few would have guessed it at first glance. She wasn't the type to flaunt her wealth or status. As the chairperson of the board of directors for TP Airlines, Audrey had risen to a position of influence and power, but she preferred to operate from the shadows. Her anonymity allowed her to observe her company's operations firsthand and experience her airline just as any other passenger would. The flight attendants began their service rounds, rolling carts laden with snacks and beverages down the aisles. Audrey watched as Flora moved through the first-class cabin, her demeanor calm and confident, seemingly oblivious to the storm she had unwittingly stirred. Flora still occasionally glanced toward the first-class cabin's empty seat, Audrey's rightful seat, and her lips pressed into a thin line each time she noticed it remained unoccupied. She still expecting her dignitary, Audrey thought, a flicker of amusement crossing her face. Flora's misplaced confidence in her assumption only solidified Audrey's resolve to see this through. As Audrey sipped on a bottle of water, Lola, the kind and attentive flight attendant from earlier, returned. She crouched slightly beside Audrey's seat, her expression warm. "Madam," Lola said softly, "I just wanted to check in and see if you needed anything else." Audrey smiled at the gesture, appreciating Lola's professionalism. "Thank you, Lola. I'm fine for now." Lola hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to speak further. Finally, she said, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I noticed what happened earlier. I want to apologize if it made you feel uncomfortable. That's not how we want any of our passengers to feel." Audrey's smile deepened. "I appreciate your kindness, Lola. You've done nothing but exemplify what customer service should be." Lola's cheeks reddened slightly, and she gave a quick nod before moving on. The brief interaction left Audrey with a sense of clarity, while Flora's actions were unacceptable. As the flight continued, Audrey carefully observed the crew. She noticed Flora's movements were growing more mechanical, her cheerful facade starting to crack under the weight of her assumptions. The dignitary she had been expecting still hadn't appeared, and the flight was now well underway. Flora's glances toward the empty first-class seat grew less confident and more uncertain. When the captain announced that the flight had reached its cruising altitude, Audrey knew it was time to make her move. She opened her phone and composed a single-word message to Mr. Jacobs. Now, the reply came almost instantly. Understood. Back on the ground, Mr. Jacobs, who had been waiting for this moment, sprang into action. He forwarded Audrey's recording along with a detailed message to George Duncan, the CEO of TP Airlines. The message was direct and professional, outlining the incident and attaching the audio file as evidence. Within minutes of receiving the email, George Duncan's office was in chaos. George, a no-nonsense executive with a reputation for taking swift action, was furious. He listened to the recording, his face darkening with each passing second. The calm, measured voice of Audrey, in contrast to Flora's dismissive tone, was damning. George immediately summoned the head of human resources and the crew operations manager to his office. They arrived within minutes, their faces tense as they took in the storm brewing in their CEO's expression. "This is unacceptable," George said, slamming his hand on the desk. "I want a full report on how this happened, and I want it by the time this flight lands. No excuses." "Yes, sir," the HR head stammered, quickly jotting down notes. "Send a message to the captain," George added. "I want him to personally inform the flight crew that their actions are being reviewed." As the ground office descended into a frenzy, Audrey remained seated in the economy cabin, her demeanor as calm as ever. She didn't need to witness the chaos firsthand to know that her plan was working. Midway through the flight, Flora passed by Audrey's seat again, her expression now noticeably strained. Audrey caught her eye and gave her a polite smile, the kind that masked far more than it revealed. Flora hesitated, her steps faltering for the briefest moment, before hurrying on. Audrey returned her attention to her laptop, typing away as though nothing had happened. But inside, she felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about her seat being taken. It was about accountability, about ensuring that every passenger, regardless of appearance or background, was treated with respect. As the flight neared its destination, Audrey leaned back in her seat, her mind already shifting to the next phase of her plan. She knew that when the plane landed, the ripple effects of her actions would be felt far beyond this single flight. The flight continued smoothly, oblivious to the storm that was now brewing on the ground. Audrey remained composed in her economy seat, her fingers idly tapping against the armrest as she watched the flight attendants move about. Flora, once confident and dismissive, now seemed restless, her eyes darting toward the first-class section, where the so-called dignitary had yet to appear. Audrey could see the subtle signs of panic creeping into Flora's movements. The way she hesitated before answering passengers' questions, the occasional distracted fidgeting with her uniform. Flora was beginning to realize that something wasn't right. Unbeknownst to her, the real turbulence wasn't in the air but on the ground. Back at TP Airlines headquarters, George Duncan, the CEO, was pacing his office like a caged lion. The forwarded email from Mr. Jacobs had hit his inbox like a bombshell. He had listened to the recorded conversation between Audrey and Flora twice. Each time, his frustration deepened. "This is outrageous," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "On one of our flights?" To her, George had worked with Audrey Wellington Wright long enough to know that she was not someone to be underestimated. She was intelligent, methodical, and above all, patient. If she had let the situation play out rather than handling it immediately, it meant she had planned her response meticulously. The HR director and crew operations manager had both been in the airline business long enough to know that a situation like this, discrimination, mistreatment of a high-profile board member, and a documented conversation, could lead to a PR disaster. George turned to the crew operations manager, his voice sharp. "How the hell did this happen? What kind of training do we give our flight attendants? And more importantly, how did no one recognize her?" The crew operations manager swallowed hard and stammered. "Sir, I sent a memo to the crew that a dignitary would fly with us today. Flora probably had no idea who Ms. Wright was." "No idea," George barked. "She didn't need to know her name. She needed to treat every passenger with respect. That's what customer service is about." The HR director cleared his throat cautiously. "Sir, what do you want us to do?" George exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "First, get in touch with the captain. Inform him that we are reviewing a critical incident on board. Tell him to ensure professionalism from the crew for the remainder of the flight. I don't want any further mistakes." "Yes, sir." "Second, Flora. We need to deal with her immediately when that plane lands. She will be taken off duty pending investigation." The HR director nodded. "Understood." And finally, George leaned back, tapping a pen against his desk. "We need damage control. If Ms. Wright chooses to make this public, it could cause serious reputational damage. I need to speak with her as soon as she lands." Back on the plane, Audrey took another sip of water, her expression unreadable. She had received Mr. Jacobs's confirmation that the message had reached the CEO, and she knew that by now, chaos was unfolding in the corporate offices. Meanwhile, Flora was still searching for a way to justify her actions. As the plane began its descent, she lingered near the first-class section, hoping to explain the situation away. But the dignitary she had spoken of, her imagined VIP, never arrived. With every passing minute, Flora's confidence wavered further. She replayed her interaction with Audrey in her mind, the weight of it growing heavier. Had she just made the biggest mistake of her career? When the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing their approach to the airport, Flora's stomach twisted in knots. The closer they got to the ground, the more anxious she became. She knew that crew reports were filed after every flight, but something about this situation felt different. She wasn't wrong. The plane touched down smoothly at the Los Angeles International Airport, the wheels kissing the tarmac as the cabin erupted into the usual post-flight activity. Passengers gathered their belongings, stretching after the long journey, eager to disembark. Audrey remained seated, calm as ever, watching Flora out of the corner of her eye. She noticed the way the young flight attendant kept checking her watch, her hands fidgeting nervously as she assisted passengers. As the doors opened and the first-class passengers exited, Flora was still scanning the crowd, looking for anyone, who might resemble the mysterious dignitary she had been expecting. No one came. Then, her radio crackled to life. "Flora, report to the crew station immediately," came a voice from the airline's ground operations team. Flora's face paled. Copy that," she responded hesitantly. As the last of the passengers exited, Flora excused herself and hurried toward the crew station. Waiting for her were two senior airline officials and the airport's airline liaison. Their expressions were unreadable, but their presence alone sent a clear message. This was serious. One of the officials, a middle-aged woman with a stern gaze, stepped forward. "Flora, please come with us. We need to discuss an urgent matter." Flora swallowed, forcing a smile. "Is something wrong?" The official didn't return the smile. "We'll discuss it inside." Flora hesitated before nodding, her hands cold as she followed them toward an airport office. Her mind raced with all the possible explanations. Maybe it was just a standard review. Maybe it had nothing to do with Audrey at all. But deep down, she knew better. Meanwhile, Audrey had exited the plane and was walking calmly through the airport terminal. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had just executed a flawless strategy. Mr. Jacobs was already waiting for her at the arrivals gate, his face alight with amusement. "Well," he asked, falling in step beside her. "She's about to find out," Audrey said simply, pulling on her sunglasses. Mr. Jacobs chuckled. "You didn't even have to raise your voice." Audrey smirked. "I never do." With that, she strode forward, disappearing into the bustling airport crowd, leaving behind the wreckage of a lesson Flora and the airline would never forget. Flora sat in a cold, sterile conference room inside the airport's administrative offices. The walls were bare except for the airline's logo, a sleek emblem of TP Airlines, which suddenly felt more ominous than prestigious. Across from her sat two senior executives, the airline's HR director and the crew operations manager. Their expressions were unreadable, their hands folded neatly over a printed document that Flora instinctively knew was about her. Her heart pounded. She had spent the entire flight convincing herself that this was just a misunderstanding, something she could talk her way out of. But now, sitting under the intense gaze of the company's higher-ups, she wasn't so sure. The HR director, a no-nonsense woman named Sylvia Carter, finally broke the silence. "Flora Williams," she began, her tone icy. "Do you have any idea why you're here?" Flora swallowed hard, keeping her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. I assume it has to do with a seating issue on today's flight." "A seating issue?" The crew operations manager, Jonathan Fields, raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you're calling it?" Flora shifted uncomfortably. I made a mistake. I thought I was following protocol. I was informed that the first-class seat was reserved for a dignitary. I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Sylvia cut in sharply. "You made an assumption based on nothing but personal bias, and you forcibly removed a high-ranking board member from her rightful seat." Flora's stomach lurched. "Board member," she echoed weakly. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You removed Audrey Wellington Wright, chairperson of the board of directors of this airline, from her own seat in first class that she personally booked weeks in advance. Flora's face drained of color. She had assumed Audrey was just another regular passenger, someone who wouldn't make a fuss. Now, she realized the depth of her mistake. We have a full record of the incident, Sylvia continued, sliding a printed transcript across the table. A detailed report, including an audio recording of your conversation with Ms. Wright, which was forwarded to the CEO mid-flight. Flora's mouth went dry. Sylvia placed her hands firmly on the table. As of this moment, you are being suspended indefinitely pending further review. Given the severity of this incident and its potential PR ramifications, we will be conducting a full investigation. Flora's head spun. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist. This was career-ending. I didn't mean any harm, Flora stammered. This meeting is over, Jonathan said, standing up. You will be escorted out of the building. Someone from HR will be in touch regarding next steps. The door swung open, and a security officer stepped in, waiting to escort her out. Flora's legs felt like heavy stone as she stood up. She wanted to protest, to explain herself, but she knew it was futile. The decision had been made. She walked out in a daze, her mind clouded with regret. Meanwhile, in a sleek corporate office downtown, Mr. Jacobs was seated comfortably in a high-backed leather chair across from TP Airline CEO George Duncan. The older man exhaled heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. You do realize the kind of PR nightmare this could have been, right? George muttered, shaking his head. Mr. Jacobs smirked slightly. I do. Lucky for you, Ms. Wright isn't one for public spectacles. But that doesn't mean she's going to let it slide. George nodded. I figured as much. He sighed. Look, Jacobs, I have immense respect for Ms. Wright. She built this airline's board from the ground up, and I know she values professionalism. But this kind of thing can't happen. I need to know how she wants us to handle this. Mr. Jacobs leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. She's already handling it, he said cryptically. George frowned. How? Jacobs chuckled. By doing nothing. Yet, George exhaled, rubbing his temples. That's what worries me. Jacob stood, buttoning his blazer. She'll call you soon enough, George. When she does, I suggest you listen. With that, he exited the office, leaving George in pensive silence. Elsewhere in Los Angeles, Audrey Wellington Wright sat on the rooftop terrace of a private lounge, sipping a glass of red wine as she watched the city lights twinkle below. She wasn't a woman who sought revenge. She believed in letting people reveal their true character. And today, Flora had done exactly that. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Jacobs. Handled. Call George when you're ready. Audrey smirked, setting down her glass. She would call him soon, but not tonight. Let them sweat a little longer. For now, she would enjoy her quiet victory. Thanks for watching my video. If you have experienced prejudice and discrimination before, please share your experience in the comment section for people to learn from it. Like this video and subscribe. Also invite your friends and family to this channel. See you in another video.